The first setting in the graphics menu is Effects Quality. This controls the complexity and density of particle effects in certain situations, mostly during spellcasting. On lower settings, there's less going on and effects fade out much quicker. On higher settings, you'll see more sparks, flames, and debris with thicker trails and longer lasting impacts. This setting can absolutely hammer your frame rate, so if you're in a large fight, don't be surprised to see your frame rate struggling. Even just casting at a wall by myself eventually cut my frame rate in half. Material quality determines how detailed surfaces look up close, like stone walls, floors, and other props. On lower settings, materials look a bit flatter, but after medium, most areas don't change too much. Some walls do get sharper from medium to ultra, but things like floors, dirt roads, and other walls barely change. Low isn't necessarily worse in many areas, but you'll notice subtle differences, like roads using larger stone slabs instead of smaller pebbles. Overall, it's a fairly subtle setting with a performance impact that isn't hugely noticeable. Fog quality didn't seem to make an appreciable difference, but fog is always moving around, drifting through the scene, so it's hard to make a really accurate comparison. There was a place in the forest where I was getting some moonbeams or sunbeams, and the resolution did seem to increase the higher you went, but it still looked really blocky on Ultra. Sky quality controls how detailed and realistic the sky and clouds look. On lower settings, clouds are simpler and flatter, while higher settings add more volume, texture, and smoother color transitions. You'll notice it most in wide landscapes, but it does have a performance hit. Foliage quality controls how dense grass, ground cover, and plants are, along with how much foliage appears in the distance. On lower settings, grass and ground cover are thin and areas can look pretty bare. Moving up, ground cover becomes much thicker and fills in large areas of the scene. Ultra adds even more density and also starts to add thicker branches to trees further out in the distance. This setting can have a heavy performance impact with areas with a lot of vegetation, so keep that in mind if you want to maximize your frame rate. Post-process quality controls screen space effects like God rays, bloom, depth of field, and other camera style effects. On lower settings, God rays are lower resolution and more blocky, and many effects are simplified or reduced. Higher settings improve the resolution and density of these effects, especially light shafts and atmospheric lighting. Going from low to ultra can result in a noticeable performance drop, even if individual post-process effects are turned off. Turning on settings like motion blur or depth of field didn't make a huge difference in performance. Shadow quality will mostly control the resolution and sharpness of shadows. On low, shadows are softer and almost in a way look more natural. Starting on high, shadows become much sharper and you'll notice more detail and density in shadows at long distances. Ultra doesn't change a ton beyond high, but it can make distant shadows a bit more defined and crisp. For the smallish difference in frame rate, I would probably keep it on high just because the extra shadows in the distance can be nice to look at. Texture quality affects the appearance of specific assets like books, some brick walls, and other props. A lot of textures are baked into the game engine, so some things like posters aren't impacted. Most textures look fine on all settings, and on lower settings, some textures just look like they haven't fully loaded yet. Because the game is always streaming assets, it can be hard to tell whether it's the setting or just the game catching up. Increasing this setting does cause VRAM usage to jump noticeably in certain scenarios. View distance controls how far into the world the game renders objects and terrain. The tricky part is the game renders differently depending on what you're doing. So in the first clip, if I were to start running around, more trees would load in the distance even on low. And on the second clip, as soon as I get on my broom, you'll see more trees and terrain in the distance. But if I get off my broom, then the terrain disappears and the trees stay floating on nothing on low. So keep it on medium or high if you want those trees to stop floating. Population quality controls how many NPCs and characters are present in the world. On lower settings, areas feel emptier, while higher settings add more people moving around, making towns and streets feel much busier. In crowded areas like Hogsmeade or some of the halls in Hogwarts, increasing this can really make the world feel alive, but can also be very taxing on your CPU. Ray-traced reflections is another tricky one because ray-traced geometry directly affects how reflections will appear. So in the first clip, you'll see that the floor basically just gets shinier, but it doesn't reflect things like the windows. But if you have ultra geometry on, as you turn up your reflection quality, you'll see much more accurate reflections, but at the cost of the floors looking much too shiny in some people's opinion. If you go the other way and keep reflections on ultra while changing the geometry, you can see that the view distance of the reflection changes considerably, and the definition of the window and lights will also change considerably. So there's kind of a sweet spot between these two settings where it doesn't look so shiny, but you still get a lot of the realistic reflections. Ray-traced shadows control how accurately light casts shadows in the world. Shadows from objects close to a surface, like your character or nearby props, are sharper and more defined, while shadows from distant objects gradually become softer. You can also notice differences in density. The player shadow is much denser and more solid, while shadows cast through windows or across the room are lighter and less intense. This creates a more realistic layering effect with the shadows, where close shadows feel grounded and distant shadows blend more naturally into the environment. This depth isn't possible with static, non-ray-traced shadows, and even though it does have its quirks, like shimmering and some popping in, it still looks very good in some places. Ray-traced ambient occlusion replaces the game's baked-in ambient occlusion with a more accurate simulation of how light interacts with objects. Shadows in corners and where surfaces meet are softer and more natural, and subtle shading appears in places baked AO often misses. Interestingly, ray-traced ambient occlusion can be even brighter in some areas, giving more balanced and realistic look. It enhances depth and separation without over-darkening the scene, making objects and corners feel much more grounded in the environment. So now we'll go through some settings to try to get you some visual fidelity without sacrificing all of your frame rate. First, effects quality, you might as well keep on low if you're not going to high or ultra because you don't see a lot of difference at medium. Material quality, I like to keep on medium at least because it does change the walls and floors in some places. Sky quality can make a nice effect, especially when you're flying around on your broom, so try to keep that on high. Foliage quality, you want it to at least render in the distance, so keep on medium. Post-process quality, try to get some God rays on medium. Shadow quality looks very sharp on high, so keep it there. Texture quality, medium. View distance, medium. And population quality, also medium, just to kind of get you some of the effect without losing everything in frames.